The Arizona sun didn't just shine, it hammered down on the earth with the weight of a blacksmith's anvil, turning the air into a shimmering curtain of copper heat. For Caleb Hartwell, the sensation was suffocating, a dry, physical pressure that sucked the moisture from his pores and left his skin coated in a grit that tasted of ancient dust and iron. He was 38 years old, but the reflection he saw in watering troughs lately looked 50, a face carved from granite and regret, eyes shadowed by the kind of things a man sees when he wears a badge for too long. His mare, Mercy, huffed a breath that sounded like tearing paper, her hooves clattering against the loose shale with a rhythm that echoed the slow, heavy thud of Caleb's own heart. In his saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth that smelled of linseed and thyme, sat the sum of his life. A tarnished U.S. Marshal's badge that had belonged to his father, a letter written in fading ink, and $847. Everything else, the house in Socorro, the furniture, the memories of a wife and daughter buried under the cottonwoods, had been sold or left behind. He was a man hollowed out by grief, seeking a place to disappear, and as he crested the final rise, he saw it. Redstone Ranch. It sat in the valley like a wound, a cluster of adobe bleeding into the red dirt. He pulled back on the reins, the leather creaking in his grip, and listened to the wind hiss through the skeletal fingers of the saguaro cacti. Mercy picked her way down the slope, the silence of the valley amplifying every sound, the crunch of stone, the squeak of the saddle, the mournful groan of a windmill that had long since lost its battle with the elements. Up close, the ranch was a disaster. The barn stood at a drunken angle, its roof gaping open like a mouth missing teeth, exposing the dark rafters to the merciless sky. The corrals were nothing but rotted mesquite poles lying in the dirt, and the well bucket sat overturned, warped and cracking in the sun. It smelled of abandonment, that distinct musty odor of dry rot and neglect, but it was his. Caleb dismounted, his boots raising puffs of fine red dust that hung suspended in the still air. He tethered Mercy to a rail that felt brittle enough to snap, then turned his attention to the house. The adobe walls were the color of dried blood, scarred by wind and rain. He placed a hand on the front door. The wood was hot to the touch, rough and splintered. It resisted him, stuck in the frame, requiring a hard shove of his shoulder. The door scraped open with a shriek of rusted hinges that sounded like a woman screaming in the distance. He stepped inside, out of the blinding glare and into the gloom. The air here was cooler but stale, smelling of wood smoke and old grease. He blinked, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the sudden darkness, his hand drifting instinctively to the worn walnut grip of the Colt revolver on his hip. The room slowly resolved itself from the shadows. A stone fireplace, cold and swept clean, dominated one wall. A rough table stood in the center, listing slightly to the left. But it was the movement against the far wall that froze the breath in Caleb's lungs. A match flared, the sulfur smell sharp and acrid, followed by the soft hiss of an oil lamp catching flame. The light bloomed, pushing back the darkness to reveal two figures rising from the gloom. They were women, but the word seemed inadequate. They were immense, statues carved from obsidian and copper, standing over 6 feet tall with shoulders that filled the room. In the flickering amber light, their shadows stretched up the walls like giants. The taller one had a face of sharp angles and a scar running from lip to jaw. The other was stockier, her forearms corded with muscle. They didn't move like frightened homesteaders. They moved with the absolute stillness of apex predators assessing a threat. Caleb's thumb brushed the hammer of his gun. The silence stretched, tight as a piano wire, until the taller woman spoke. Her voice was a low drumbeat in the quiet room. "Tonight, you must sleep with both of us." It wasn't a seduction. It was delivered with the flat, dead tone of a judge reading a sentence. "That is the rule," the shorter one added, her voice sharper, like dry twigs snapping. "For anyone who buys this house." Caleb's instincts, honed by 12 years of hunting men who didn't want to be found, shifted gears. He took his hand off the gun and held his palms up, the universal sign of truce. "I'm Caleb Hartwell. I bought this place." The tension in the room didn't break. It just changed flavor, shifting from aggression to a wary, cornered fear. The shorter woman, who he would learn was named Kaia, limped forward and slapped a piece of tanned hide onto the table. The sound was a dull thud, heavy and final. "Read." Caleb stepped closer, the floorboards groaning under his boots. In the yellow wash of the lamplight, the ink on the hide looked like dried venom. It was a contract, brutal in its simplicity, labor in exchange for debt, human beings reduced to ledger entries. Garrett Vance, the previous owner, had bound these women, Talasi and Kaia, to the land like livestock. Caleb read the words, and a cold fury began to rise in his gut, a familiar anger that tasted like copper pennies. He looked up, meeting their dark, defiant eyes. He reached into his pocket, the fabric rustling loudly in the quiet, and pulled out the badge. He set it on the table next to the hide. Metal clinked against wood. "This document," Caleb said, his voice gravelly with thirst and rage, "is garbage. I don't own people, and nobody sleeps where they don't want to." Night fell over the desert with sudden violence, the temperature dropping until the air felt crisp and cold. Outside, by a fire that popped and spat sparks into the velvet sky, the story unfolded. The smell of burning mesquite, sweet and pungent, mixed with the scent of coffee boiling in a battered tin pot. Talasi and Kaia sat across the flames, their faces intermittent masks of orange light and deep shadow. They spoke of the Apache wars, of losing their family to soldiers, of wandering, starving, until Garrett Vance found them. They spoke of the initial kindness that had curdled into exploitation, the whip scars hidden beneath their sleeves, the forgery of their marks on the contract. Caleb listened, sipping the bitter, scalding coffee, watching the firelight dance in their dark eyes. He heard the tremor in Talasi's voice when she spoke of the betrayal, and the snap of anger in Kaia's when she described the beatings. When silence finally reclaimed the night, broken only by the lonely, shivering cry of a coyote, Caleb made his offer: a partnership, equal shares, no debts. He saw them exchange a look, a silent communication forged in years of survival. "1 week," Talasi said finally, the firelight catching the hard line of her jaw. "We try for 1 week. If you lie, we kill you." Caleb looked at the two women, then at the vast, star-dusted darkness of the territory beyond. "Deal," he said, and in the darkness, the pact was sealed. 3 weeks of labor transformed the ranch from a graveyard into something living, a change measured in the groan of straining wood and the metallic screech of the well pulley. The mornings began before the sun, in the blue-gray twilight, where the air tasted of cold sage and damp earth. Caleb, Talasi and Kaia worked with a rhythm that had become a language of its own, the grunt of effort, the scrape of a shovel, the heavy thud of a fence post finding purchase in the hardpan. They had hit water, a glorious, freezing seep that smelled of deep limestone, and the sound of it trickling into the trough was the sweetest music Caleb had heard in years. But the supplies were dwindling. The coffee tin was light, rattling with the last few beans, and the coil of fencing wire was gone. They had to go to Copper Springs. They rode out at dawn, the heat already building like a pressure wave. Caleb rode Mercy, while the sisters rode double on a pale, skeletal mare they had named Ghost. The journey was a passage through a furnace. The horizon shimmered with mirages that looked like pools of mercury. The only sounds were the steady, rhythmic crunch of hooves on gravel and the buzzing of cicadas rising from the mesquite like an electric current. As the town of Copper Springs materialized from the dust, a cluster of weathered wood bleaching in the sun, Caleb felt a knot of tension tighten in his stomach. It wasn't just a town, it was a gauntlet they had to run. They rode down the main street, and the silence that greeted them was heavy and hostile, a tangible weight that pressed against their skin. Conversations died mid-sentence. The clamor of a blacksmith's hammer ceased, leaving a ringing echo that faded into an uncomfortable quiet. Caleb could feel the eyes tracking them, suspicious, angry, predatory. A woman pulled her child behind her skirts. A man on a porch spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust with a wet, deliberate splat. They tied the horses outside McAllister's general store, the leather reins slipping through sweat-slicked fingers. Inside, the store was dim and cool, a sensory collision of dry goods, the dust of flour, the sharp tang of pickle brine, and the rich, earthy smell of cured tobacco. But the air was thick with something else: prejudice. McAllister, the proprietor, stared at Talasi and Kaia with eyes like flint. He slammed the goods onto the counter, flour, sugar, nails, each item landing with a violent crack that made the sisters flinch. "Cash only," he growled, the words grinding out like stones. Caleb paid, the coins clinking loudly in the tense silence. He could smell his own fear, a sour note beneath the dust, but he held his ground. They walked out into the blinding light, their arms full, only to hear a voice call out from the shadows of the sheriff's office, a voice that carried the weight of a past life. Hartwell. Sheriff Tom Clayton's office smelled of gun oil, old paper, and coffee that had been boiling on the stove since yesterday, a burnt, acidic aroma that coated the throat. Clayton looked older than Caleb remembered, his face mapped with the deep lines of desert living. He poured 2 cups of the black sludge, the ceramic scraping against the desk. The news he delivered was worse than the coffee. Garrett Vance, the man who had enslaved the sisters, owed money to Cole Hastings. The name hung in the small room like smoke. Hastings was a shadow over the territory, a man whose debts were collected in blood and property. "He travels with a private army," Clayton warned, his voice low, the sound of a man who knew he was outmatched. "If he comes for the ranch, Caleb, I can't stop him." The ticking of the wall clock seemed to grow louder, each second a hammer blow counting down to violence. Caleb felt the cold reality of it settle in his bones. He wasn't just fighting for a patch of dirt anymore. He was standing between 2 women and a monster. He walked back out into the street, his mind racing, only to find a new threat waiting. A man named Pike, smelling of stale whiskey and unwashed horse, blocked the sisters' path. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt, a grin spreading across his face like a crack in dry mud. The air buzzed with sudden violence. "Your partners?" Pike sneered, the words dripping with insinuation. "Wonder what a man does with 2 squaws out here." The insult hit the air like a slap. Caleb didn't think. He moved. The sound of his Colt clearing leather was a sharp, metallic snick that stopped the world. In a heartbeat, the cold steel of the barrel was pressed against Pike's inner thigh, right where the artery pulsed. The crowd that had gathered gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen from the street. Caleb could smell the sudden acrid spike of Pike's fear, could see the sweat beading on the man's upper lip. "Apologize," Caleb whispered, his voice deadly quiet, barely audible over the rush of blood in his own ears. Pike froze, his eyes wide, feeling the pressure of the gun. "I apologize," he choked out. Caleb held the position for 3 long seconds, letting the terror marinate before holstering the weapon with a smooth, practiced motion. The silence that followed was total, broken only by the shifting of a horse's hoof in the dirt. They mounted up and rode out, backs stiff, feeling the town's gaze burning into their spines. They were alive, but the war had begun. As the buildings faded into the heat haze behind them, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of a storm that would wash the dust away, but leave the blood behind. The deadline arrived not with a bang, but with a suffocating stillness. It was August 15th, the day the debt came due. The ranch lay baking under a white, pitiless sky, the air so still that the squeak of a hawk on the wind sounded like a rusty hinge. Inside the adobe house, the heat was a physical presence, heavy and trapped. Caleb sat by the window, cleaning his Winchester. The smell of solvent and gun oil was sharp, cutting through the scent of old dust. Snick-clack. The lever action was a comforting mechanical rhythm in the quiet. Talasi and Kaia were shadows in the room, their tension radiating like heat from a stove. Then, the silence broke. It started as a vibration in the floorboards, a low tremor that traveled up through Caleb's boots. Mercy, the mare in the barn, let out a high, terrified whinny that tore through the afternoon. Caleb stood, the rifle heavy in his hands, and looked out. On the horizon, a brown curtain was rising against the blue sky, dust, a lot of it. The rumble of hooves grew from a whisper to a roar, the sound of a storm made of flesh and iron. Caleb counted the shapes emerging from the haze. 12 riders, then a 13th, trailing behind like an afterthought. They fanned out in a semicircle, the leather of their saddles creaking, bits jingling like sinister wind chimes. At the center sat Cole Hastings on a black stallion that looked like a hole in the world. He was a man who wore his power like a tailored suit, calm, immaculate, terrifying. He dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the dirt with a solid, authoritative thud. When he spoke, his voice wasn't the gravelly bark of a gunman. It was smooth, cultured, like expensive whiskey poured over ice. "I'm looking for my property," he called out. Caleb stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under his weight. The air between them shimmered. Hastings smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. He laid out his terms with the casual indifference of a man buying cattle. The debt was unpaid, the law was on his side, and he was taking the women. 3 years of labor, Hastings offered, the words hanging in the hot air like poison, in the Silverton mines. Behind Caleb, he could hear the sisters breathing, shallow, angry breaths. He could smell the metallic tang of adrenaline spiking in the room. "No," Caleb said. The word fell like a stone. Hastings sighed, the sound of a disappointed schoolteacher, and signaled to the 13th rider. It was Garrett Vance. Garrett was a ruin of a man. Bound to his saddle, he slumped forward, his face a swollen map of purple and black bruises. One eye was shut tight, the other swimming with pain and defeat. He smelled of dried blood and sour sweat. When they cut his bonds, he slid from the horse like a sack of wet grain, hitting the ground with a sickening crunch. He stumbled toward the porch, clutching his ribs, his breath rattling in his chest like dry leaves. He didn't look at Hastings. He looked at Talasi and Kaia, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his face. "The contract," Garrett rasped, his voice a broken whisper. "I forged it, and the notary. I killed him." The confession hung in the air, shocking in its clarity. Garrett turned, his body swaying, and pointed a trembling finger not at the men, but at a large, nondescript rock 20 feet from the porch. "Proof," he choked out. "Buried there." Hastings looked bored. He checked a gold pocket watch, the lid snapping open with a crisp click. "Enough theater," Hastings said. Garrett let out a sob that turned into a scream and lunged. It was a desperate, clumsy motion, a small knife flashing from his boot. The violence was sudden and deafening. Hank Morrison, Hastings' enforcer, drew his pistol with a speed that blurred the eye. Crack! The gunshot was physically painful in the enclosed valley, a thunderclap that slapped against the eardrums. Garrett stopped mid-stride, a red blossom exploding on his chest. He looked down, surprised, and crumpled to the dirt. Dust puffed up around his body. The silence that followed was heavy, ringing with the aftermath of the explosion. Garrett lay still, his hand outstretched, dead finger still pointing at the rock. Hastings merely brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve. 5 minutes, he called out, checking his watch again. "Decide, or we come in." Inside the house, the air was thick with the smell of burnt gunpowder drifting in through the door. "We run!" Caleb hissed. He grabbed Kaia's arm. "Talasi, you stall them at the front. Kaia and I go out the back. We get to that rock." It was a suicide plan, born of desperation. They moved to the back window. The frame stuck, then gave way with a scrape of wood on wood. Caleb boosted Kaia through, her boots scuffing the adobe wall, and vaulted after her into the blinding sunlight of the rear yard. They crouched low, the heat of the ground radiating through their souls. "Go," Caleb whispered. They sprinted. The sound of their breathing was loud, ragged, a harsh counterpoint to Talasi's voice drifting from the front of the house, calm and stalling. They reached the dry wash, sliding down the bank in a shower of pebbles that sounded like falling rain. They scrambled along the bottom, hidden from view, until they were parallel with the rock. Now, they surged up the bank. The rock was hot enough to burn skin. Caleb and Kaia heaved, their muscles straining, grunting with effort. The stone grated aside, revealing a hollow earth pocket and an oilcloth pouch. Caleb snatched it, the fabric slick in his hand. "Hey!" The shout came from the flank. A rider had spotted them. "Run!" Caleb screamed. A bullet zipped past his ear like an angry hornet. Thud. Another kicked up dirt into his eyes. They scrambled back into the wash as the air erupted with gunfire, the pop, pop, pop of pistols echoing off the canyon walls. They ran, lungs burning, legs pumping, diving into the labyrinth of red rocks, just as the posse's horses thundered in pursuit, the sound of iron shoes on stone closing in like a tightening noose. The red rocks were a labyrinth of heat and shadow, a geological maze designed to trap sound and distort direction. Caleb and Kaia squeezed into a fissure barely wide enough for a ribcage. the sandstone pressing against their backs like a rough, hot hand. Outside, the clop-clop of shod hooves echoed off the canyon walls, bouncing and multiplying until it sounded like 100 riders were closing in. A voice drifted down from the ridge, distorted by the wind. "Check the south draw." Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, wet drumbeat he feared the searchers could hear. He unrolled the oilcloth pouch with trembling fingers. The paper inside crinkled loudly, too loudly in the stillness. It was Garrett's confession, written in a shaky hand, smelling of stale tobacco and guilt. The sun crawled across the strip of sky above them, dragging long purple shadows with it. They waited, sweat drying into a salty crust on their skin, listening to the flies buzz in the heat. Slowly, agonizingly, the sounds of the hunt faded, hoofbeats retreating into the distance, leaving only the whistle of the wind through the stone flutes of the canyon. They moved like ghosts back to the box canyon where the pale mare, Ghost, waited. She shied as they approached, smelling the fear and gunpowder on them. They mounted double, the horse groaning under the weight, her hooves slipping on the loose shale. The ride to Copper Springs was a blur of agony. The sun set, painting the desert in bruises of violent violet and black. The mare's breath came in ragged, wet heaves, foam flecking her neck, her sides heaving between Caleb's legs. Every jolt sent a spike of pain through his exhausted spine. The wind whipped past their ears, carrying the chill of the coming night, crying through the brush. They didn't speak. There was no breath left for words, just the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of hooves on hardpack, a desperate race against the clock ticking down in the darkness back at the ranch, where Talasi stood alone against 12 guns. They burst into the sheriff's office, startling Clayton, who spilled coffee across his desk. The liquid dripped onto the floor, drip, 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 marking the seconds. Caleb slammed the pouch down. "Proof," he rasped, his throat raw as sandpaper. "Murder. Forgery." Clayton read, his face hardening like setting concrete. Arthur Brennan, the lawyer, stepped from the shadows, his eyes scanning the documents. "This changes everything," Brennan whispered, the paper rustling in his hands. He took the confession and walked out into the street. He didn't shout. He knocked. Door to door. The town woke up. You could hear it shift, the low murmur of voices questioning, the heavy clunk of bolts sliding back, the metallic ratchet clack of rifles being levered. It wasn't an angry mob. It was a cold, determined tide. 15 men gathered, the air thick with the smell of horse sweat, gun oil, and resolve. Even McAllister, the storekeep, stood there, clutching a buffalo rifle. The prejudice of the town had been outweighed by a hatred for tyranny. They rode back under a three-quarter moon that turned the desert into a landscape of bone and ink. They crested the rise above Redstone Ranch in absolute silence. Below, Hastings' campfires flickered like dying stars, the smell of wood smoke drifting up to meet them. The posse descended, a wave of dark shapes flowing like oil. Hastings' men scrambled, boots scuffling in the dirt, hands flying to weapons. But they froze. The click of 15 hammers cocking at once sounded like a dry branch snapping in a winter forest, crisp, loud, and final. Clayton rode into the firelight. "Cole Hastings," he announced, his voice echoing off the adobe walls. "You are done." From the house, a single shot rang out, crack, fired into the air. Talasi stood in the doorway, smoke curling from her Winchester, the sharp scent of sulfur marking her survival. Hastings slumped, the air going out of him like a deflated lung. The chains rattled as they led him away, a metallic sound of finality that signaled the end of an empire. Garrett was buried at sunrise, the shovel slicing into the earth with a wet, heavy rhythm. But the story didn't end in the dirt. Over the years, the sounds of Redstone changed. The ominous silence of the ghost ranch was replaced by the lowing of cattle, the ringing of a blacksmith's anvil, and the laughter of children playing in the water trough. It became a sanctuary for the cast-offs, the Apache, the unwanted. When Caleb died, decades later, the room was filled not with the silence of the dead, but with the living breath of a community. As the mourners stood by his grave, the wind still blew through the saguaros, hissing over the land. But it no longer carried the scent of fear or the dry taste of dust. It carried the smell of rain on the red earth, the scent of sage blooming in the night, and the enduring, quiet strength of the stone.